Chapter 8, The Martians. Part 1, The First Martian Invasion. Upon the foothills of the new and titanic mountains that were once the Hindu Kush were many holiday centers, whence the young men and women of Asia were wont to seek alpine dangers and hardships for their souls' refreshment. It was in this district, and shortly after a summer dawn, that the Martians were first seen by men. Early walkers noticed that the sky had an unaccountably greenish tinge, and that the climbing sun, though free from cloud, was wan. Observers were presently surprised to see the green concentrate itself into 1,000 tiny cloudlets, with clear blue between. Field glasses revealed within each fleck of green some faint hint of a ruddy nucleus, and shifting strands of an infrared color, which would have been invisible to the earlier human race. These extraordinary specks of cloud were all of about the same size, the largest of them appearing smaller than the moon's disk, but in form they varied greatly, and were seen to be changing their shapes more rapidly than the natural cirrus which they slightly resembled. In fact, though there was much that was cloud-like in their form and motion, there was also something definite about them, both in their features and behavior, which suggested life. Indeed, they were strongly reminiscent of primitive amoeboid organisms seen through a microscope. The whole sky was strewn with them, here and there in concentrations of unbroken green, elsewhere more sparsely, and they were observed to be moving. A general drift of the whole celestial population was setting toward one of the snowy peaks that dominated the landscape. Presently, the foremost individuals reached the mountain's crest and were seen to be creeping down the rock face with a very slow amoeboid action. Meanwhile, a couple of aeroplanes, electrically driven, had climbed the sky to investigate the strange phenomenon at close quarters. They passed among the drifting cloudlets, and actually through many of them, without hindrance and almost without being obscured from view. On the mountain, a vast swarm of the cloudlets was collecting and creeping down the precipices and snowfields into a high glacier valley. At a certain point, where the glacier dropped steeply to a lower level, the advance guard slowed down and stopped, while hosts of their fellows continued to pack in on them from behind. In half an hour, the whole sky was once more clear, save for normal clouds, but upon the glacier lay what might almost have been an exceptionally dark, solid-looking thundercloud, save for its green tinge and seething motion. For some minutes, this strange object was seen to concentrate itself into a somewhat smaller bulk and become darker. Then it moved forward again and passed over the cliffy end of the glacier into the pine-clad valley. An intervening ridge now hid it from its first observers. Lower down the valley there was a village. Many of the inhabitants, when they saw the mysterious dense fume advancing upon them, took to their mechanical vehicles and fled, but some waited out of curiosity. They were swallowed up in a murky olive-brown fog, shot here and there with queer shimmering streaks of a ruddier tint. Presently there was complete darkness. Artificial lights were blotted out almost at arm's length. Breathing became difficult. Throats and lungs were irritated. Everyone was seized with a violent attack of sneezing and coughing. The cloud streamed through the village and seemed to exercise irregular pressures upon objects, not always in the general direction of movement, but sometimes in the opposite direction, as though it were getting a purchase upon human bodies and walls, and actually elbowing its way along. Within a few minutes the fog lightened, and presently it left the village behind it, save for a few strands and whiffs of its smoke-like substance, which had become entangled in side streets and isolated. Very soon, however, these seemed to get themselves clear and hurry to overtake the main body. When the gasping villagers had somewhat recovered, they sent a radio message to the little town lower down the valley, urging temporary evacuation. The message was not broadcast, but transmitted on a slender beam of rays. It so happened that the beam had to be directed through the noxious matter itself. While the message was being given, the cloud's progress ceased, and its outlines became vague and ragged. Fragments of it actually drifted away on the wind and dissipated themselves. Almost as soon as the message was completed, the cloud began to define itself again and lay for a quarter of an hour at rest. A dozen bold young men from the town now approached the dark mass out of curiosity. No sooner did they come face to face with it, round a bend in the valley, then the cloud rapidly contracted till it was no bigger than a house. Looking now something between a dense, opaque fume and an actual jelly, it lay still until the party had ventured within a few yards. Evidently their courage failed, for they were seen to turn. But before they had retreated 3 paces, a long proboscis shot out of the main mass with the speed of a chameleon's tongue and enveloped them. Slowly it withdrew, but the young men had been gathered in with it. The cloud, or jelly, churned itself violently for some seconds, then ejected the bodies in a single chewed lump. The murderous thing now elbowed itself along the road towards the town, leaned against the first house, crushed it, and proceeded to wander hither and thither, pushing everything down before it, as though it were a lava stream. The inhabitants took to their heels, but several were licked up and slaughtered. Powerful beam radiation was now poured into the cloud from all the neighboring installations. Its destructive activity slackened, and once more it began to disintegrate and expand. Presently it streamed upwards as a huge column of smoke, and at a great altitude it dissipated itself again into a swarm of the original green cloudlets, noticeably reduced in numbers. These again faded into a uniform greenish tinge which gradually vanished. Thus ended the first invasion of the Earth from Mars. Part 2. Life on Mars. Our concern is with humanity, and with the Martians only in relation to men. But in order to understand the tragic intercourse of the 2 planets, it is necessary to glance at conditions on Mars and conceive something of those fantastically different yet fundamentally similar beings who are now seeking to possess man's home. To describe the biology, psychology, and history of a whole world in a few pages is as difficult as it would be to give the Martians themselves in the same compass a true idea of man. Encyclopedias, libraries would be needed in either case. Yet somehow I must contrive to suggest the alien sufferings and delights and the many eons of struggle which went to the making of these strange non-human intelligences, in some ways so inferior yet in others definitely superior to the human species which they encountered. Mars was a world whose mass was about 1/10 that of the Earth. Gravity, therefore, had played a less tyrannical part in Martian than in terrestrial history. The weakness of Martian gravity combined with the paucity of the planet's air envelope to make the general atmospheric pressure far lighter than on Earth. Oxygen was far less plentiful. Water also was comparatively rare. There were no oceans or seas, but only shallow lakes and marshes, many of which dried up in summer. The climate of the planet was, in general, very dry, and yet very cold. Being without cloud, it was perennially bright, with the feeble rays of a distant sun. Earlier in the history of Mars, when there were more air, more water, and a higher temperature from internal heat, life had appeared in the coastal waters of the seas, and evolution had proceeded in much the same manner as on Earth. Primitive life was differentiated into the fundamental animal and vegetable types. Multicellular structures appeared and specialized themselves in diverse manners to suit diverse environments. A great variety of plant forms clothed the lands, often with forests of gigantic and slender-stemmed plumes. Mollusk-like and insect-like animals crept or swam or shot themselves hither and thither in fantastic jumps. Huge spidery creatures of a type not wholly unlike crustaceans or gigantic grasshoppers bounded after their prey and developed a versatility and cunning which enabled them to dominate the planet, almost as, at a much later date, early man was to dominate the terrestrial wild. But meanwhile, a rapid loss of atmosphere and especially of water vapor was changing Martian conditions beyond the limits of adaptability of this early fauna and flora. At the same time, a very different kind of vital organization was beginning to profit by the change. On Mars, as on the Earth, life had arisen from one of many subvital forms. The new type of life on Mars evolved from another of these subvital kinds of molecular organization, one which had hitherto failed to evolve at all and had played an insignificant part, save occasionally as a rare virus in the respiratory organs of animals. These fundamental subvital units of organization were ultramicroscopic and indeed far smaller than the terrestrial bacteria or even the terrestrial viruses. They originally occurred in the marshy ponds which dried up every spring and became depressions of baked mud and dust. Certain of their species, born into the air upon dust particles, developed an extremely dry habit of life. They maintained themselves by absorbing chemicals from the wind-borne dust and a very slight amount of moisture from the air. Also, they absorbed sunlight by a photosynthesis almost identical with that of the plants. To this extent, they were similar to the other living things, but they had also certain capacities which the other stock had lost at the very outset of its evolutionary career. Terrestrial organisms and Martian organisms of the terrestrial type maintained themselves as vital unities by means of nervous systems or other forms of material contact between parts. In the most developed forms, an immensely complicated neural telephone system connected every part of the body with a vast central exchange, the brain. Thus, on the Earth, a single organism was, without exception, a continuous system of matter, which maintained a certain constancy of form. But from the distinctively Martian subvital unit there evolved at length a very different kind of complex organism, in which material contact of parts was not necessary either to coordination of behavior or unity of consciousness. These ends were achieved upon a very different physical basis. The ultramicroscopic subvital members were sensitive to all kinds of ethereal vibrations, directly sensitive, in a manner impossible to terrestrial life, and they could also initiate vibrations. Upon this basis, Martian life developed at length the capacity of maintaining vital organization as a single conscious individual without continuity of living matter. Thus, the typical Martian organism was a cloudlet, a group of free-moving members dominated by a group mind. But in one species, individuality came to inhere, for certain purposes, not in distinct cloudlets only, but in a great fluid system of cloudlets. Such was the single-minded Martian host which invaded the Earth. The Martian organism depended, so to speak, not on telephone, wires, but on an immense crowd of mobile wireless stations, transmitting and receiving different wavelengths according to their function. The radiation of a single unit was of course very feeble, but a great system of units could maintain contact with its wandering parts over a considerable distance. One other important characteristic distinguished the dominant form of life on Mars. Just as a cell, in the terrestrial form of life, has often the power of altering its shape, whence the whole mechanism of muscular activity, so in the Martian form, the free-floating ultramicroscopic unit might be specialized for generating around itself a magnetic field, and so either repelling or attracting its neighbors. Thus, a system of materially disconnected units had a certain cohesion. Its consistency was something between a smoke cloud and a very tenuous jelly. It had a definite, though ever-changing contour and resistant surface. By massed mutual repulsions of its constituent units, it could exercise pressure on surrounding objects, and in its most concentrated form, the Martian cloud jelly could bring to bear immense forces, which could also be controlled for very delicate manipulation. Magnetic forces were also responsible for the mollusk-like motion of the cloud as a whole over the ground, and again for the transport of lifeless material and living units from region to region within the cloud. The magnetic field of repulsion and attraction generated by a subvital unit was much more restricted than its field of wireless communication. Similarly with organized systems of units. Thus, each of the cloudlets which the second men saw in their sky was an independent motor unit, but also it was in a kind of telepathic communication with all its fellows. Indeed, in every public enterprise, such as the terrestrial campaigns, almost perfect unity of consciousness was maintained within the limits of a huge field of radiation. Yet only when the whole population concentrated itself into a small and relatively dense cloud jelly did it become a single magnetic motor unit. The Martians, it should be noted, had three possible forms, or formations, namely, first, an open order of independent and very tenuous cloudlets in, telepathic, communication, and often in strict unity as a group mind. Second, a more concentrated and less vulnerable corporate cloud. And third, an extremely concentrated and formidable cloud jelly. Save for these very remarkable characteristics, there was no really fundamental difference between the distinctively Martian and the distinctively terrestrial forms of life. The chemical basis of the former was somewhat more complicated than that of the latter, and selenium played a part in it, to which nothing corresponded in terrestrial life. The Martian organism, moreover, was unique in that it fulfilled within itself the functions of both animal and vegetable. But, save for these peculiarities, the two types of life were biochemically much the same. Both needed material from the ground, both needed sunlight. Each lived in the chemical changes occurring in its own flesh. Each, of course, tended to maintain itself as an organic unity. There was a certain difference indeed in respect of reproduction, for the Martian subvital units retained the power of growth and subdivision. Thus the birth of a Martian cloud arose from the subdivision of myriads of units within the parent cloud, followed by their ejection as a new individual. And, as the units were highly specialized for different functions, representatives of many types had to pass into the new cloud. In the earliest stages of evolution on Mars, the units had become independent of each other as soon as they parted in reproduction. But later, the hitherto useless and rudimentary power of emitting radiation was specialized, so that, after reproduction, free individuals came to maintain radiant contact with one another, and to behave with ever-increasing coordination. Still later, these organized groups themselves maintained radiant contact with groups of their offspring, thus constituting larger individuals with specialized members. With each advance in complexity, the sphere of radiant influence increased, until, at the zenith of Martian evolution, the whole planet, save for the remaining animal and vegetable representatives of the other and unsuccessful kind of life, constituted sometimes a single biological and psychological individual. But this occurred as a rule only in respect of matters which concerned the species as a whole. At most times the Martian individual was a cloudlet, such as those which first astonished the second men. But in great public crises, each cloudlet would suddenly wake up to find himself the mind of the whole race, sensing through many individuals, and interpreting his sensations in the light of the experience of the whole race. The life which dominated Mars was thus something between an extremely well-disciplined army of specialized units and a body possessed by one mind. Like an army, it could take any form without destroying its organic unity. Like an army, it was sometimes a crowd of free-wandering units, yet at other times also it disposed itself in very special orders to fulfill special functions. Like an army, it was composed of free, experiencing individuals who voluntarily submitted themselves to discipline. On the other hand, unlike an army, it woke occasionally into unified consciousness. The same fluctuation between individuality and multiplicity, which characterized the race as a whole, characterized also each of the cloudlets themselves. Each was sometimes an individual, sometimes a swarm of more primitive individuals. But while the race rather seldom rose to full individuality, the cloudlets declined from it only in very special circumstances. Each cloudlet was an organization of specialized groups formed of minor specialized groups, which in turn were composed of the fundamental specialized varieties of subvital units. Each free-roving group of free-roving units constituted a special organ, fulfilling some particular function in the whole. Thus, some were specialized for attraction and repulsion, some for chemical operations, some for storing the sun's energy, some for emitting radiation, some for absorbing and storing water, some for special sensitivities, such as awareness of mechanical pressure and vibration, or temperature changes, or light rays. Others, again, were specialized to fulfill the function of the brain of man, but in a peculiar manner. The whole volume of the cloudlet vibrated with innumerable wireless messages and very many wavelengths from the different organs. It was the function of the brain units to receive and correlate and interpret these messages in the light of past experience, and to initiate responses in the wavelengths appropriate to the organs concerned. All these subvital units, save a few types that were too highly specialized, were capable of independent life as airborne bacteria or viruses. And whenever they lost touch with the radiation of the whole system, they continued to live their own simple lives until they were once more controlled. All were free-floating units, but normally they were under the influence of the cloudlet system of electromagnetic fields, and were directed hither and thither for their special functions. And under this influence some of them might be held rigidly in position in relation to one another. Such was the case of the organs of sight. In early stages of evolution, some of the units had specialized for carrying minute globules of water. Later, much larger droplets were carried, millions of units holding between them a still microscopic globule of life's most precious fluid. Ultimately, this function was turned to good account in vision. Aqueous lenses as large as the eye of an ox were supported by a scaffolding of units, while, at focal length from the lens, a rigid retina of units was held in position. Thus, the Martian could produce eyes of every variety whenever he wanted them, and telescopes and microscopes too. This production and manipulation of visual organs was of course largely subconscious, like the focusing mechanism in man. But latterly the Martians had greatly increased their conscious control of physiological processes, and it was this achievement which facilitated their remarkable optical triumphs. One other physiological function we must note before considering the Martian psychology. The fully evolved, but as yet uncivilized, Martian had long ago ceased to depend for his chemicals on wind-borne volcanic dust. Instead, he rested at night on the ground, like a knee-high mist on terrestrial meadows, and projected specialized tubular groups of units into the soil, like rootlets. Part of the day also had to be occupied in this manner. Somewhat later, this process was supplemented by devouring the declining plant life of the planet. But the final civilized Martians had greatly improved their methods of exploiting the ground and the sunlight, both by mechanical means and by artificial specialization of their own organs. Even so, however, as their activities increased, these vegetable functions became an ever more serious problem for them. They practiced agriculture, but only a very small area of the arid planet could be induced to bear. It was terrestrial water and terrestrial vegetation that finally determined them to make the great voyage. Part 3. The Martian Mind. The Martian mind was of a very different type from the terrestrial, different, yet at bottom identical. In so strange a body, the mind was inevitably equipped with alien cravings and alien manners of apprehending its environment. And with so different a history, it was confused by prejudices very unlike those of man. Yet it was nonetheless mind, concerned in the last resort with the maintenance and advancement of life and the exercise of vital capacities. Fundamentally, the Martian was like all other living beings, in that he delighted in the free working of his body and his mind. Yet superficially, he was as unlike man in mind as in body. The most distinctive feature of the Martian, compared with man, was that his individuality was both far more liable to disruption and at the same time immeasurably more capable of direct participation in the minds of other individuals. The human mind in its solid body maintained its unity and its dominance over its members in all normal circumstances. Only in disease was man liable to mental or physical dissociation. On the other hand, he was incapable of direct contact with other individuals, and the emergence of a supermind in a group of individuals was quite impossible. The Martian cloudlet, however, though he fell to pieces physically and also mentally far more readily than a man, might also at any moment wake up to be the intelligent mind of his race, might begin to perceive with the sense organs of all other individuals, and experience thoughts and desires which were, so to speak, the resultant of all individual thoughts and desires upon some matter of general interest. But unfortunately, as I shall tell, the common mind of the Martians never woke into any order of mentality higher than that of the individual. These differences between the Martian and the human psyche entailed characteristic advantages and disadvantages. The Martian, immune from man's inveterate selfishness and spiritual isolation from his fellows, lacked the mental coherence, the concentrated attention and far-reaching analysis and synthesis, and again the vivid self-consciousness and relentless self-criticism, which even the first men at their best had attained in some degree, and which in the second men were still more developed. The Martians, moreover, were hampered by being almost identical in character. They possessed perfect harmony, but only through being almost wholly in temperamental unison. They were all hobbled by their sameness to one another. They were without that rich diversity of personal character, which enabled the human spirit to cover so wide a field of mentality. This infinite variety of human nature entailed, indeed, endless, wasteful, and cruel personal conflicts in the first, and even to some extent in the second, species of man. But also it enabled every individual of developed sympathy to enrich his spirit by intercourse with individuals whose temperament, thought, and ideals differed from his own. And while the Martians were little troubled by internecine strife and the passion of hate, they were also almost wholly devoid of the passion of love. The Martian's individual could admire and be utterly faithful to the object of his loyalty, but his admiration was given not to concrete and uniquely charactered persons of the same order as himself, but at best to the vaguely conceived spirit of the race. Individuals like himself he regarded merely as instruments or organs of the supermind. This would not have been amiss had the mind of the race, into which he so frequently awoke under the influence of the general radiation, been indeed a mind of higher rank than his own. But it was not. It was but a pooling of the percipience and thought and will of the cloudlets. Thus it was that the superb loyalty of the Martians was squandered upon something which was not greater than themselves in mental caliber, but only in mere bulk. The Martian cloudlet, like the human animal, had a complex instinctive nature. By night and day, respectively, he was impelled to perform the vegetative functions of absorbing chemicals from the ground and energy from the sunlight. Air and water he also craved, though he dealt with them, of course, in his own manner. He had also his own characteristic instinctive impulses to move his body, both for locomotion and manipulation. Martian civilization provided an outlet for these cravings, both in the practice of agriculture and in intricate and wonderfully beautiful cloud dances and gymnastics. For these perfectly supple beings rejoiced in executing aerial evolutions, flinging out wild rhythmical streamers, intertwining with one another in spirals, concentrating into opaque spheres, cubes, cones, and all sorts of fantastical volumes. Many of these movements and shapes had intense emotional significance for them in relation to the operations of their life, and were executed with a religious fervor and solemnity. The Martian had also his impulses of fear and pugnacity. In the remote past, these had often been directed against hostile members of his own species, but since the race had become unified, they found exercise only upon other types of life and upon inanimate nature. Instinctive gregariousness was, of course, extremely developed in the Martian at the expense of instinctive self-assertion. Sexuality the Martian had not. There were not partners in reproduction. But his impulse to merge physically and mentally with other individuals and wake up as the supermind had in it much that was characteristic of sex in man. Parental impulses of a kind he knew, but they were scarcely worthy of the name. He cared only to eject excessive living matter from his system and to keep en rapport with the new individual thus formed, as he would with any other individual. He knew no more of the human devotion to children as budding personalities than of the subtle intercourse of male and female temperaments. By the time of the first invasion, however, reproduction had been greatly restricted, for the planet was fully populated, and each individual cloudlet was potentially immortal. Among the Martians there was no natural death, no spontaneous death through mere senility. Normally, the cloudlet's members kept themselves in repair indefinitely by the reproduction of their constituent units. Diseases, indeed, were often fatal, and chief among them was a plague, corresponding to terrestrial cancer, in which the subvital units lost their sensitivity to radiation so that they proceeded to live as primitive organisms and reproduce without restraint. As they also became parasitic on the unaffected units, the cloudlet inevitably died. Like the higher kinds of terrestrial mammal, the Martians had strong impulses of curiosity. Having also many practical needs to fulfill as a result of their civilization, and being extremely well equipped by nature for physical experiment and microscopy, they had gone far in the natural sciences. In physics, astronomy, chemistry, and even in the chemistry of life, man had nothing to teach them. The vast corpus of Martian knowledge had taken many thousands of years to grow. All its stages and its current achievements were recorded on immense scrolls of paper made from vegetable pulp and stored in libraries of stone. For the Martians, curiously enough, had become great masons and had covered much of their planet with buildings of feathery and toppling design, such as would have been quite impossible on Earth. They had no need of buildings for habitation, save in the Arctic regions, but as workshops, granaries, and storerooms of all sorts, buildings had become very necessary to the Martians. Moreover, these extremely tenuous creatures took a peculiar joy in manipulating solids. Even their most utilitarian architecture blossomed with a sort of Gothic or Arabesque ornateness and fantasy, wherein the ethereal seemed to torture the substance of solid rock into its own likeness. At the time of the invasion, the Martians were still advancing intellectually, and indeed it was through an achievement in theoretical physics that they were able to leave their planet. They had long known that minute particles at the upper limit of the atmosphere might be borne into space by the pressure of the sun's rays at dawn and sunset. And at length they discovered how to use this pressure as the wind is used in sailing. Dissipating themselves into their ultra-microscopic units, they contrived to get a purchase on the gravitational fields of the solar system, as a boat's keel and rudder get a purchase on the water. Thus they were able to tack across to the Earth as an armada of ultra-microscopic vessels. Arrived in the terrestrial sky, they reformed themselves as cloudlets, swam through the dense air to the alpine summit, and climbed downwards, as a swimmer may climb down a ladder underwater. This achievement involved very intricate calculations and chemical inventions, especially for the preservation of life in transit and on an alien planet. It could never have been done save by beings with far-reaching and accurate knowledge of the physical world. But though, in respect of natural knowledge, the Martians were so well advanced, they were extremely backward in all those spheres which may be called spiritual knowledge. They had little understanding of their own mentality and less of the place of mind in the cosmos. Though in a sense a highly intelligent species, they were at the same time wholly lacking in philosophical interest. They scarcely conceived, still less tackled, the problems which even the first men had faced so often, though so vainly. For the Martians, there was no mystery in the distinction between reality and appearance, or in the relation of the one and the many, or in the status of good and evil. Nor were they ever critical of their own ideals. They aimed wholeheartedly at the advancement of the Martian superindividual. But what should constitute individuality and its advancement they never seriously considered. And the idea that they were under obligation also towards beings not included in the Martian system of radiation proved wholly beyond them. For, though so clever, they were the most naive of self-deceivers and had no insight to see what it is that is truly desirable. Part 4. Delusions of the Martians. To understand how the Martians tricked themselves and how they were finally undone by their own insane will, we must glance at their history. The civilized Martians constituted the sole remaining variety of a species. That species itself, in the remote past, had competed with and exterminated many other species of the same general type. Aided by the changing climate, it had also exterminated almost all the species of the more terrestrial kind of fauna and had thereby much reduced the vegetation which it was subsequently to need and foster so carefully. This victory of the species had been due partly to its versatility and intelligence, partly to a remarkable zest in ferocity, partly to its unique powers of radiation and sensitivity to radiation, which enabled it to act with a coordination impossible even to the most gregarious of animals. But, as with other species in biological history, the capacity by which it triumphed became at length a source of weakness. When the species reached a stage corresponding to primitive human culture, one of its races, achieving a still higher degree of radiant intercourse and physical unity, was able to behave as a single vital unit, and so it succeeded in exterminating all its rivals. Racial conflict had persisted for many thousands of years, but as soon as the favored race had developed this almost absolute solidarity of will, its victory was sweeping and was clinched by joyous massacre of the enemy. But ever afterwards, the Martians suffered from the psychological effects of their victory at the close of the epoch of racial wars. The extreme brutality with which the other races had been exterminated conflicted with the generous impulses which civilization had begun to foster, and left a scar upon the conscience of the victors. In self-defense, they persuaded themselves that since they were so much more admirable than the rest, the extermination was actually a sacred duty. And their unique value, they said, consisted in their unique radiational development. Hence arose a gravely insincere tradition and culture, which finally ruined the species. They had long believed that the physical basis of consciousness must necessarily be a system of units directly sensitive to ethereal vibrations, and that organisms dependent on the physical contact of their parts were too gross to have any experience whatever. After the age of the racial massacres, they sought to persuade themselves that the excellence or ethical worth of any organism depended upon the degree of complexity and unity of its radiation. Century by century, they strengthened their faith in this vulgar doctrine, and developed also a system of quite irrational delusions and obsessions based upon an obsessive and passionate lust in radiation. It would take too long to tell of all these subsidiary fantasies, and of the ingenious ways in which they were reconciled with the main body of sane knowledge. But one at least must be mentioned, because of the part it played in the struggle with man. The Martians knew, of course, that solid matter was solid by virtue of the interlocking of the minute electromagnetic systems called atoms. Now, rigidity had for them somewhat the same significance and prestige that air, breath, spirit had for early man. It was in the quasi-solid form that Martians were physically most potent, and the maintenance of this form was exhausting and difficult. These facts combined in the Martian consciousness with the knowledge that rigidity was, after all, the outcome of interlocked electromagnetic systems. Rigidity was thus endowed with a peculiar sanctity. The superstition was gradually consolidated by a series of psychological accidents into a fanatical admiration of all very rigid materials, but especially of hard crystals, and above all of diamonds. For diamonds were extravagantly resistant, and at the same time, as the Martians themselves put it, diamonds were superb jugglers with the ethereal radiation called light. Every diamond was therefore a supreme embodiment of the tense energy and eternal equilibrium of the cosmos, and must be treated with reverence. In Mars, all known diamonds were exposed to sunlight on the pinnacles of sacred buildings, and the thought that on the neighbor planet might be diamonds which were not properly treated was one motive of the invasion. Thus did the Martian mind, unwittingly sidetracked from its true development, fall sick, and strive ever more fanatically towards mere phantoms of its goal. In the early stages of the disorder, radiation was merely regarded as an infallible sign of mentality, and radiative complexity was taken as an infallible measure merely of spiritual worth. But little by little, radiation and mentality failed to be distinguished, and radiative organization was actually mistaken for spiritual worth. In this obsession, the Martians resembled somewhat the first men during their degenerate phase of servitude to the idea of movement, but with a difference. For the Martian intelligence was still active, though its products were severely censored in the name of the spirit of the race. Every Martian was a case of dual personality. Not merely was he sometimes a private consciousness, sometimes the consciousness of the race, but further, even as a private individual, he was in a manner divided against himself. Though his practical allegiance to the super-individual was absolute, so that he condemned or ignored all thoughts and impulses that could not be assimilated to the public consciousness, he did in fact have such thoughts and impulses, as it were in the deepest recesses of his being. He very seldom noticed that he was having them, and whenever he did notice it, he was shocked and terrified, yet he did have them. They constituted an intermittent, sometimes almost a continuous, critical commentary on all his more reputable experience. This was the great tragedy of the spirit on Mars. The Martians were in many ways extremely well equipped for mental progress and for true spiritual adventure, but through a trick of fortune which had persuaded them to prize above all else unity and uniformity, they were driven to thwart their own struggling spirits at every turn. Far from being superior to the private mind, the public mind which obsessed every Martian was in many ways actually inferior. It had come into dominance in a crisis which demanded severe military coordination, and though, since that remote age, it had made great intellectual progress, it remained at heart a military mind. Its disposition was something between that of a field marshal and the god of the ancient Hebrews. A certain English philosopher once described and praised the fictitious corporate personality of the state and named it Leviathan. The Martian superindividual was Leviathan, endowed with consciousness. In this consciousness there was nothing but what was easily assimilated and in accord with tradition. Thus the public mind was always intellectually and culturally behind the times. Only in respect of practical social organization did it keep abreast of its own individuals. Intellectual progress had always been initiated by private individuals, and had only penetrated the public mind when the mass of individuals had been privately infected by intercourse with the pioneers. The public consciousness itself initiated progress only in the sphere of social, military, and economic organization. The novel circumstances which were encountered on the Earth put the mentality of the Martians to a supreme test. For the unique enterprise of tackling a new world demanded the extremes of both public and private activity, and so led to agonizing conflicts within each private mind. For, while the undertaking was essentially social and even military, and necessitated very strict coordination and unity of action, the extreme novelty of the new environment demanded all the resources of the untrammeled private consciousness. Moreover, the Martians encountered much on the Earth which made nonsense of their fundamental assumptions. And in their brightest moment of private consciousness, they sometimes recognized this fact.